principles, and we'll deal with that later in the teaching. I know we got to take a break in a moment, but in the scripture, it talks about, for we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers, and against rulers of darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. That's this externalization of hierarchy. That is the spiritual hierarchy and these avatars. Much of this was taught in Kabbalah as it was expressed in Theosophy. What became popular in the last 10, 15, 20 years is Kabbalistic teaching, New Age theories and New Age teachings, which are based on those teachings. Therefore, we have spiritualized humanism. So what God are the humanists really following, and who is the architect of their plans? That's why they're succeeding, at least in the world system. And if it wasn't for the Lord to return, we would be in great trouble, because they would succeed. Just as the Tower of Babel, they would have succeeded, but God saw what they were doing, trying to make a name for themselves, and then he confounded them and changed their languages to separate them so that they would not be one once again.
And we got to take a break. I hope you're paying close attention to what because we have a lot of things coming up that you're going to be extremely interested in. And we got to take a quick break. And at this time, we will be taking calls from our listeners. When you call today, I want you to try to stay on this subject. Ask whatever questions that you need to ask concerning the subject, and maybe it might be something that we haven't discussed yet, but as long as it is understood by what we're talking about today, this global governments, or the global governance, I should say, one world order, these type of issues, or email me, and I'll be happy to interject your question into the conversation. The number's 800-342-8430. Going to ask you to give us a quick call, and we'll be right back after the break. I have a question that came in from the email, and I'll read it, John, but they're asking the question, is it possible who or what are the building burgers? And we don't want to get into that right now. We are going to be discussing that in full on another one of the programs. But I thank you for calling and asking that question. But rather, I want to go to David in Australia. David, welcome to Sunlight Broadcasting. Do you have a quick question or comment?
Yeah, I was just wondering, how does the United Nations compare with the Russians, what they're doing in today's world with Aleppo and with the nuclear weapons up against Poland and Lithuania?
Well, let's look at some of the functions and developments that the United Nations is supposed to be doing. I have a book here called The United Nations and How It Works. This book was quite old, but it's a mentor book to help people understand. And on the back cover, it tells itself, this book tells clearly and simply what the United Nations organization has done, is doing all over the world about disarmament, control of the atom, human rights, settling quarrels between nations, helping the hungry, and many other great problems which concern us all. In other words, this is supposed to be a utopian organization that is to disseminate the things that are necessary to bring peace and harmony and cooperation into the world, but most certainly it fails. In fact, dealing with revolutions, it says this in the book: the United Nations is not the cause of the great revolutions that are going on at present, though it may be well the ship that will carry the human race alive through the troubled waters. The world is going through at least 3 different waves of progress at the same time. There have also been many waves of backlash towards savagery. Now, I won't do it right at the moment, but I'll quote it in a minute. But interestingly enough, these 3 waves were better explained in a book called The Third Wave by Alvin Toffler. He's written a book called Future Shock. But Toffler has some very interesting things. I'm answering your question, but I'm also teaching, David, so just bear with me, because all of these things tie together so perfectly when you read and understand them. In this book, Toffler writes, "We're no longer where we stood a decade ago, dazzled by changes whose relationships to one another were unknown. Today, behind the confusion of change, there's a growing coherence of pattern, the future's taking shape." He goes on to say, in a great historical confluence, many raging rivers of change are running together to form an oceanic third wave of change that is gaining momentum with every passing hour. The third wave of historical change represents not a straight line extension of industrial society, but a radical shift of direction, often a negation of what went before. It adds up nothing less than it adds up to nothing less than a complete transformation, at least as revolutionary in our day as the Industrial Revolution was 300 years ago. The goal of this change is a paradigm change. Now, right now, the United Nations does not have teeth. It is an organization that does not have a ruling police force or military capability, so they obviously have to cooperate, and they're trying to still wait for the nations to come together with the unified agreement necessary to empower them to create the one world order and the rule of law that the world should follow. So that's why the United Nations is really helpless when it comes to issues, when it deals like with Russia, when it deals with even the United States, when it deals with some of the things that are taking place. They could speak things, but unfortunately, they've also seen great internal corruption, which has compromised their credibility over the years as well. I don't know if I'm helping you, but I think that's kind of how I see the situation. You gentlemen might want to add your thoughts if there's consideration.
Yeah, David, do you have more that you want to say on that to John?
Yeah, because at the moment Russia is being separated from the United Nations in a number of areas like humanitarian and that sort of thing concerning Aleppo. And it's also pulled itself away from the United Nations. And I was just wondering if that's got to do with anything towards the political shift in the Middle East.
Well, there has been a change since Putin has come along, obviously, from the thoughts of what took place under Gorbachev. Gorbachev, as you recall, was a strong globalist and actually since he left, and now carries a unique post in the world. He is strongly promoting globalism and world unity, and even an advocate for the United Nations, if I could use that terminology. But keep in mind, these things aren't long-lived. You know, where Russia is going right now and what they're doing is just, I think their strength has evolved, and especially in the last 8 to 10 years, because of the weakness that the United States has presented. The Middle East has been really where the Cold War was established and founded, and that's really what was fought over, was that land in the Middle East. In fact, you know, I could spend hours because of the studies I've done dealing with post-Germany and Russia and really the Islamic community in the Middle East, what transpired there, the development and relationship building that the United States had with the Arab nations versus Russia. Now Russia sees an open opportunity because their allegiance to Iran has increased and their relationship has improved, and Iran is making great strides. They've got an estimated, they claim, according to their news, 25,000 that have gone into Europe. They have, and I'm talking about Iranians that potentially could be militaristic. They've obviously infiltrated places and have assisted with the Hezbollah. There have been the Revolutionary Guard that's been participating with the Bashar al-Assad government, and maybe that's why he's been so difficult to take down. That's speculation on my part. So we're seeing a strengthening of these nations, but isn't that biblical? Because when we look in the Bible, in Ezekiel chapter 38, we see the northern countries, I believe, to be representative of Russia, and we see Iran as allies, and their goal is to bring destruction to Israel. So these relationships are being formed biblically. I believe this, David, and I'm belaboring the point, but I'm also trying to do some teaching while I'm answering your question, is we're going to not see the success of the United Nations take place. It's not going to happen. The Bible doesn't teach us that it's going to happen. But we are seeing those that believe it can happen, and that's what's transforming Western societies significantly. It's not changing the Eastern societies or the other countries that have tyrants or religious zeal ruling them. It's changing the Western nations, and that's their goal. Remember, this plan of Satan is to bring chaos. Satan doesn't do anything that's not done outside of chaos. In fact, ironically, one of the expressions used by those that are in the New World Order is the idea of creating chaos to bring order out of it, order out of chaos. This is what they do. So they create the chaos to create the confusion so that everybody will look for a solution from those that created the chaos because they're in leading power and authority. It sounds confusing, but it's not. It's very simple. So I really think if we're looking at the Bible, Miss Francis, and that's my gauge, is what does the Bible teach about Russia? What does the Bible teach about Iran? What does the Bible say about Israel? The Bible doesn't so much speak of the Western nations, ironically. It speaks more about what's going to happen in the Middle East, in this area that we would call the Promised Land, and the lands that surround the Promised Land. We see that in Psalm 83, these nations that are confederate to destroy Israel and cut her off from being a nation. Everything else in the world that's happening around that is shaping that event, those events, I should say. Not so much that I'm worried about there's going to be success in a one world order. Even the Bible teaches that with the Antichrist, he's not going to succeed in creating a one world order because it's not going to happen. God's going to stop it.
Okay, let's ask David if he has further on that. David? David has... has John answered your question?
Okay.
Yeah, that's right, yeah. But there is one little thing. Can you tell me what nation of today is the Edomites?
Well, the Edomites are no longer in existence, but if we were to look at the countries of Edom, it would take the southern area of what we call modern-day Jordan would be where Edom was located.
Because one of my friends that used to study the Bible a lot didn't realize that that Herod the Great was actually an Edomite.
He was an Edomite, and the Edomites were greatly... they have the descendants of Esau, Edom, were greatly opposed to Israel, and you're absolutely right. He was a descendant of the Edomites.
He was, or should I say, Esau was also was more or less hated by God for giving away his birthright for a plate of food. Is that correct?
Well, the scripture says God hated Esau and loved Jacob. It meant that he preferred Jacob. It wasn't so much that he hated Esau. Esau could have repented and walked in the paths of righteousness, but chose to serve his flesh and his own desires instead of following the will of God. But really, Jacob was the one, even though he did greatly wrong in how he obtained the birthright, was the one that I believe God had chosen to receive the birthright because his heart was right in God's foreknowledge. I'm not saying God forced Esau to hate him. That's not what he did, but in his foreknowledge, he saw that. But you're right. Good perspective. And the Edomites continued to dislike and hate God. In fact, in the book of Obadiah, we see great destruction on them because they greatly came against Israel, the Hebrew people in the wilderness, and would not let them pass through their land and oppose them. God will judge nations, and he will judge peoples that do not bless his people. That's why we see in Matthew chapter 25, the sheep nations and the goat nations that Jesus will judge when he returns. Those are the nations that blessed Israel. Those are the nations that cursed Israel. God's going to judge those. So how we view Israel, I think, is very important in this hour.
Okay, David, did you have...
God bless you, sir.
Thank you so much for calling. Let's quickly go to Donna in Oklahoma. Donna, you have a quick question or comment?
Yes. I'll make a quick background statement and then ask a question, and then I'll hang up for your answer. My background statement is this. I understand that in the country of Australia, Citibank is now having all of their branches to go cashless. At the same time, they say India is in somewhat of chaos because their people have been given 10 days to turn all their cash into the banks. I also heard that Germany and Sweden are both looking to do the same thing. I suspect this is going to happen here, so my question to John is, don't you think it's going to happen here? And if so, how soon do you think that's going to happen? And I'll hang up and listen for your answer. Thank you.
Great question, Donna. Great question. Thank you for asking it. Part of this whole transformation that's taking place in this New World Order has been to remove cash from society. The reason is this: you can control, obviously, the exchange and flow of money much easier if there was cashless society or if cash itself did not carry the value. We have what we call fiat money anyway, paper money or Federal Reserve notes. It has no value except what is attributed to it. And the value of that actually decreases as a result of increasing inflation. $1 today, it's still the same paper bill, but 30 years ago, you could buy a lot more with it than you can with it today. We have seen, and Wilder Kennelin years ago wrote a book, Little Money or None, I believe was the name of it, that predicted that ultimately we would head towards a cashless society. That has been the objective for many years. Cash is expensive to handle, to transact, so it's far easier today. You're seeing the increase in transactions, for example. Companies like Visa and MasterCard are seeing far higher increases every year, double-digit increases in their transactions because people are moving away from cash. We're ultimately going to have a cashless society. Right now, you can't really get a stock certificate, for example, unless you pay extra for it, but many companies do not want to issue stocks. You can't get a U.S. government bond in a certificate form. It's all held book entry. So there's no more evidence of your ownership except the book entry evidence that's found through your holdings at your bank or your brokerage firm. We're moving away from cash. That has been part of their goal since history of this. When we'll get there, we're halfway there now. I mean, I look at my wallet week to week. I never have cash in it. I don't need it anymore.
Right.
It just is unnecessary. You have debit cards that tie into your checking accounts. You have credit cards that offer you all kinds of reward bonuses. Most people don't use cash much anymore, so we're pretty much close to that. Now, the implications, as you know, Ms. Francis, are if we have no more cash in society and no more savings, what does an individual do? Does that give the government power? Should they take it to confiscate your money?
And I think that's people's concern.
Yeah, that potentially could happen because we look at in Crete what happened there a year and a half ago when the government came in and took advantage of some of the savings that were in the banks and the people were unable to get their money out, saw a devaluation of their money. I don't think we're there in this country yet, and that would start a revolution if it did.
Yeah.
But a lot of folks are out there buying gold and silver, thinking that's going to protect them from a cashless society to give them merchandise to exchange. First of all, it would be illegal to go into a store and try to buy something with gold. That is not considered tender that could be used for a barter and exchange. So when we get down to reality, those things will not be able to be used. We saw evidence of that in the 1930s. It became illegal to own gold bullion. You had to turn it in. They gave you the funny paper called reserve notes in return, and the Federal Reserve Bank was given all the gold. The fact is, there's no safe place if it gets that bad.
Mm-hmm.
There really isn't. Our trust is in God, and the good news is we're praying it doesn't get that bad. And the Lord, and I'm not an escapist, I'm not looking for the Lord to take me out before things get bad, but our hope is in Christ, and we're to comfort one another with those words.
But you can understand people's concerns.
Oh, sure. I'm concerned about it too.
Because it's like you say, do their savings, they just going to vanish away? Yeah. You know, what happens to what they put back for retirement and so forth and so on? Very legitimate question. All right, quickly, let's move on to Josh in Texas. Welcome to Sunlight Broadcasting, Josh. You have a quick question?
Yes, Sister Francis. John Bosenthal, God bless you, brother.
Thank you.
I wanted to say, I wanted to ask you, have you considered the more layman terms of how they use the modern institutions for this purpose, such as Alcoholics Anonymous or television media?
Yeah, we're going to be covering all that in this series. It's not going to be something we're doing one day. We're going to be doing this, I guess, for several of weeks.
Yeah.
But you're absolutely right, my friend. This idea, this direction has been implemented now for many years and is coming into place. I know years ago I did a study on sensitivity training, and it was actually created by the government. It really was a principle that was used by communists. It was part of the group thinking process. How do we help an individual or get them to think like the rest of the group? And there are strategies to isolate that individual, make him feel guilty or her, make them become conformed to the group. And think about it. We now
and that cell group
the cell group is the same structure.
Right.
So we have the same structure in Alcoholics Anonymous, Drugs Anonymous, and all these different programs that we see.
And we're going to be discussing that. We don't want to get ahead of ourselves, Josh, but you stay tuned. We're going to discuss this every week.
Excellent question and thought.
Yeah,
that is
very good
that is
question.
Part and parcel with
it's all part of it.
you don't mind, I'd like to interject something here.
Sure, go ahead.
When I was watching the show last week or so, I remember Philip from Ireland calling, and he was talking about Britain's exit from the EU. And he asked if we believe that was a part of the movement of the Antichrist movement. And I was so touched by listening to him that if he's listening to today's program, I want him to know that we hear him here as fellow believers, and yes. And by the prayers, and Sister Francis said it many times, prior to the election, if we don't get a good president in here other than Hillary Clinton, it's going to further the cause. And so, but yeah, I don't want to get ahead of you guys either, but I just hope that people listening to your programs will understand that it's vital to pay attention to what you're saying, because this is the Babylonian movement, or the Freemasonry is self-identified as Babylonian,
right?
And their whole agenda is mingling the world religions together, and that's what they, and of course that's how they use these variety of tools. And also too, on TBN, I had shared with Jim Nations before in a personal phone call that they have 2 Seventh-day Adventists on the program, so they're mingling religions already on TBN. We need to be watchful in all these things. I love you all so much.
Thank you.
Yes.
And I hope to catch up with you again on a future segment.
Yes,
okay, thank you, Josh. And one of the terms that we hear so often on television is so much like it's almost a brainwashing, coming together, unity.
Yeah.
You hear it on television, you hear it in the church. And that's all going to be discussed because it's all a part of it. All right, Chris in Iowa, welcome to Sunlight Broadcasting. Chris, you have a quick question for John?
Yes, I do, John. Thanks for taking my call. My name is Chris Rose from Christ Rose Ministries, and I hold a personal testimony of being delivered from homosexuality through the power of the cross.
Well, praise the Lord.
Yeah, praise the Lord. He leads my way. He certainly does. It's
Good
been a journey,
Chris.
and I am so thankful for his life in me, and that's our ministry. Anyway, the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon asked a question. Now, this is an article that I had read. His question was, what do you gain by making others less equal? And he was making a passionate address to the heads of state on global LGBT rights. Now, President or Vice President Biden also made a comment saying this is the civil rights issue of our time. And he also made a simple statement to say they love one another, or his father said to Joe Biden, they love one another. It's just that simple. So my question is, what is the hype? Why is there so much interest in LGBT rights when it comes to globalism?
Here's an interesting take, and again, I've read these things probably going into 35 years of reading. I wouldn't call myself an expert, I'm just very well read, and I've read what others have said. Here's my take on it. It might be different than what anyone's ever heard before, but I think what's going on right now in the world is the dissenters, those that are not willingly embracing the one world order, the one world idea, the one world coming together. They have to fish out the dissenters. And what better way to do that than to use issues that would warrant someone to be upset or not to cooperate, such as one's thoughts towards the LGBT community. Those that would dissent against that would be considered those that are not yet conformed to what the society is looking to have. The idea of diversity and unity, I'm not opposed to that in any sense of the way. But we as believers want the freedom and liberty to proclaim and preach the gospel of Jesus Christ. So what better way to fish out those that want that freedom and liberty than to use issues that would create opposition? Now, does that make any sense to everybody?
Yes, it does.
I really see this being the case. And again, I'm going into it a little bit between the lines because I've read so much of this, that they will use opportunities, maybe even a Donald Trump getting what he has done. And again, I think he was the will of the people speaking, but it did show the number of people in this country that are dissatisfied with the direction of our country. But notice even in speeches I've heard recently from Barack Obama, encouraging the Democrat Party to continue to work. In other words, the children of this generation are said to be wiser than the children of light. They know how the world system works. If they don't get it now, they'll go back underground and go to work, and they'll figure out a way to get it later. And that's why we've seen everything moving to the left. We've seen nothing go to the right. The conservative views have all moved to the left. Many conservatives now would not be considered conservatives 30 years ago because they're so far to the left. But you do it gradually and nobody sees it anymore. So what ends up happening is if we would say something critical about the lifestyle of the homosexual, we're a dissenter and we're still on the out fringe and need to be brought in or we need to be remediated. But the reality is we do love the homosexual. We want them to have the truth. We want them to have the fullness of Christ. We want them to be blessed. And isn't it interesting, Chris, how you're coming out of that lifestyle, you're now serving the Lord, it sounds like, being a blessing to the work of God, but your voice is never heard in the mainstream media. Your voice is never heard in the magazines or the newspapers. Right. They have silenced the thousands and maybe millions of individuals that have been delivered out of that lifestyle and are now speaking not to harm the people, but to share what God has done for them, but they're not able to speak it. So it's a one-way street.
Doesn't fit the agenda.
It doesn't fit the
so
agenda.
You're talking about a tolerance or a supposed tolerance that is very intolerant of any opposing view.
Yeah. Okay, Chris, I hope John's helped you. We got to go to a quick break. Did you have anything else you wanted to say or ask?
Well, I just wanted to say thank you for taking my question and, pray over our ministry, Christ Ministry. We will have a televised interview in South Carolina on December 13th. So we've been praying for open doors for our ministry to go out so that the Christian community can hear this perspective of the gospel through a life of a reformed homosexual. So we just pray that we will just continue to stand in truth and really just evangelize and that's. But we appreciate your prayers. And
thank you, Chris.
Thank you for calling. And we're going to a quick break, and we're going to be right back after the break with our next caller.
Francis and friends, we're delighted you're able to tune in and join us. We've been addressing and dealing with the New World Order and the history of it, where it began, and we've been covering that. We're going to be doing several teachings on this coming up in the next handful of days and weeks. We want you to better understand what is the agenda, what is going on, what is Agenda 21, what is this issue with climate change, what is happening now in the world right now with regard to the Arab Spring. Are all these things related in some form or fashion? Is there an agenda to try to create a world order? Is there an agenda to bring global governance? There is, and we're trying to break it down and show you the history of those that have participated in high places that are cooperating and working together to do this. Is it a conspiracy? Call it what you will, but it sadly, unfortunately, is maybe more a reality. That's what we've been addressing. So we're in the period of time where we're taking your questions and calls, and right now we want to welcome Jay from Ohio to the program. Jay, how are you today?
Hey, I'm doing fine, John. Thank you very much. It's been a long time no see.
Yes, sir. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine.
Excellent.
Hey, got a question on Donald Trump and the populist movement, and I was just wondering if he's going to maybe be able to get this Johnson Amendment passed. That's one question, part of it, and this populist movement, like in Brexit and in here, if this is going to if he's going to be able to expose any of the, I hate to say it, any of the government secrets, but, they don't want us to hear, if he's going to be able to bring out any of that, or if he's going to be able to do any of the things as far as, like, criminality, if he's going to be able to get any of that done through, too. So I'll just hang up and see what your idea is on it. Okay, and thank you very much. It's a pleasure to see you again.
Yeah, good to hear from you, my friend. That's a great thought. Anything we would say at this premature point would be speculation. We can only go by what Donald Trump has said and what his intentions are. The phrases he's used, drain the swamp, things of that nature, I think resonate with the hearts of many Americans. Many have known and have, at least if they haven't known, they have suspected there are things happening that are not in their best interests. Obviously, this last 8 years, in fact, it goes back much further, we have seen a tremendous deceleration in economic opportunity for our country. The trade agreements have become a concern because of the reality of the jobs lost, just as the reality of the extremely high costs and premiums for affordable health care. Mine went up for 2017 43%. That's a huge increase, considering the year before that it was up double digits, over 20%, and the year before that it was up close to 20%. So my healthcare costs have almost doubled. And that's me, and I know many others that are in the same situation. So we have a creature there that needs to be reined in and addressed, or else it'll become unsustainable. But again, the goal was to create a universal healthcare system where the government would control it, because it would become too outrageous for the private sector to handle. But good thoughts. I'm hoping the Trump administration will succeed in the objectives that he had. And I'm praying. That's why we need to pray for him and to pray for others, because America did speak just as the Brexit vote spoke. And there are folks that still carry. Now, notice, just as Brexit.
But he's coming under tremendous influence.
Pressure,
And pressure. And he's going to be influenced. And but right now, praying for him.
Yes.
That's exactly what we could do. And, you know, my hope and my prayer is that he keeps his promises to the American people. That's because that would be a disaster if he didn't. But at the same time, I know what he's facing out there.
Yeah.
But listen, thank you, Jay. And let's go to Virgil in Mississippi, and welcome to Sun Life Broadcasting, Virgil.
Yes, ma'am. My question is, can the one world system be stopped? Is it God's will?
Well, that's why they're fighting Donald Trump so well. He's not a part of it. And that's why they were so afraid of him. So they did. Hillary Clinton is a part of it. Donald Trump is not. And that's what I mentioned a few minutes ago. Is he going to be influenced by it? That we've got to pray about. We don't know. I'm praying he won't. John, you have a comment on that?
Well, again, like you said, there is some. There's lots of moving parts here. It's not as simple as it sounds.
That's right.
And to implement some of the things he wants to do are going to cost money. It's going to have to be something addressed financially. Building the wall, he's saying Mexico will pay for it. But at the same time, it still has to be developed. You're talking about a lot of backlash. People are saying they're going to divest from companies that cooperate in building the wall. I mean, you're hearing all types of things. And that's what
you got the protesters. They're going to be protesting everything.
Every little step is now going to have the protesters out there, and that's all designed to bring Trump and his administration to compromise. So it's going to take a lot of backbone.
It's a lot to it.
You have to understand that it's a spirit. It's demonic. It comes from the Tower of Babel, and they're just like a snake. They'll crawl back under a rock.
Yeah.
And they'll come out later. You mentioned that earlier.
That's a great way of putting it.
That's exactly what they're going to do. They'll crawl right under a rock,
and then later
until
they'll come back
everything
out.
blows over and people go to sleep again. I hope we don't do that very soon.
Right.
That we will stand and we'll pray for this man.
Yeah.
Plead the blood of Christ.
The church is the restraining order of righteousness in the world. And if the church does what it's supposed to do, like Jim is saying, we could stand against the wiles of the devil. We can submit to God and resist the devil, but we have to submit to God first. And if the pulpit stands for righteousness and begins to preach and teach and do what we're doing, encourage the people to pray, encourage the people to not just say, oh Lord, bless them, but enter into intercessory prayer and let the Holy Spirit begin to move on them. First of all, they'll be greatly blessed by the presence
and be
of God.
aware of what's taking place out there so you can be in that position to pray about it.
Yeah.
And take advantage of the opportunities that are here while they're available.
That's
I believe
exactly.
if the Lord would speak, He would say, "I'll give you a window. Get your job done. You get this done."
That's exactly.
Giving you an opportunity. You need to do what you're supposed to do. Preach the word. Be instant in season, out of season, and that's what we need to do.
Paul
Pray
would
for
say
our
this
leaders.
in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. He said, "But ye, children, are not into darkness, that the day should overtake you as a thief. You are all children of light, and the children of the day. We are not of the night, nor of darkness. Therefore, let us not sleep, as do others, but let us watch and be sober." We have a Christian responsibility to be awake and not be drunken and moved into this. See, this stuff it's a drug. It's like a drug.
Right.
Yes, it
It
is.
will get you in. It will give you a sense of well-being. It's all lies, because the scripture says they will speak great swelling words of vanity to allure you through the lust of the flesh. Peter would say in 2 Peter chapter 3. So they're drawn into this because it feels good, it sounds good.
Right.
But reality is, it's like the snake. He used a good example. Will hypnotize
That's right.
its prey. And that prey is totally free to fly away, a little birdie. And I've watched it, on those programs on TV where they have the animals, and I've seen it many times. The person will say, the moderator will say, that little bird could fly right away, that snake is too far away, but it'll just snare and slowly slither its way.
Right.
And finally, it'll get that little bird. And that bird was free the whole time. If we allow ourselves to be seduced by the lies that have come through Purpose Driven, G12, that have come through certain areas of our political left, our colleges and universities, every person should greatly reevaluate where they're going to get their education.
Amen.
Because they're not being educated anymore, they're being indoctrinated.
We could always say that too about the schools.
The local, I mean,
Yeah,
your child rearing, as far as, we have a school here, for example, but someone who is going to public school versus going to a Christian school better reevaluate, because they're going to see behavioral changes in their children, and those kids are going to be indoctrinated as they become a student of the ideology of the progressives.
Exactly.
I mean, the nuts that came out of the 1960s are a result of what was taught in the educational systems.
Exactly. All right, let's quickly go to Mark in Pennsylvania. But before I put you on the air, I want to say this to the panel as well as to the listeners. We need to not only pray for some things, but we need to pray against
Very good.
other things.
Very good.
I mean, stand firm in prayer against what George Soros and Planned Parenthood and all of them are trying to accomplish by paying people to go out and protest. They call it protest, but the people are getting paid to do it, so that's just their job. Very few of them really are there to protest. But when you see evil start raising its head, we need to pray against that. We're taught to pray for people that God can turn them around, and that's true. But when it's evil, you need to pray against that.
That's
and
right.
there's some people that you need to pray against, that their agenda does not advance, but that God will stop it. All right, I'm going to Mark in Pennsylvania. Welcome to Sunlight Broadcasting, Mark. You have a quick question or comment?
Yes, thank you. Good morning, Francis and friends, and thank you for all that you do and the preaching of the uncompromised word.
Okay.
I have one quote. It's just real short. I'd like to read, and then a brief question. The late Dr. Adrian Rogers, he was a very fine preacher, in my opinion. He once said that it's better to be divided on truth than to be united in error. And I love that, and I think that's very appropriate for today's discussion.
Mark, read that again, if you would, so that people can hear that.
It's better to be divided on truth than to be united in error. And I think that's very appropriate. Whenever the gospel is in question, I think it's very appropriate for today's discussion.
Excellent. Thank you for that.
Yeah, and going back to the cashless society, I was surprised the gentleman from Australia didn't mention that, but it was brought up. That was part of my question, but I'd like to tie in the negative interest rate, the potential collapse of the bond market, and this cybersecurity, digital cash. It seems like the New World Order is knocking on the doorstep, and it's going to be interesting to see how, I believe it could come as early as next year. The signs are there. It's just people may be crying out for this sort of thing when there's financial chaos and if the banks shut down. It's kind of scary. I'd like to hear your comments on it.
Well, again, I've heard for the last 30 years that next year is the year that the banking system is going to collapse. We don't know that for sure. We've seen, of course, great difficulty in the financial system, hence the necessity for the tax anticipation or the TARP program. We have, when that took place and the bailing out of the big banks, the idea of too big to fail was also nonsense as well. We saw more rules and regulations come in against the banking industry. Banks right now, though, look favorable. Their balance sheets look actually fairly good in comparison to where they were years ago. But we also saw the consequences of the societal pressures on the banks with regard to loans and then creating loan hybrids that were not sustainable because people with low income deserve the right to own an expensive home. I don't know if we're there yet. I've heard about the dollar collapsing for 25 years, and yet the dollar has continued to gain strength more and more and more. we can't make those predictions. We have seen the move towards negative interest rates, but now we're kind of moving away from negative interest rates. Countries like Germany that slipped into negative interest rates are moving out of negative interest rates now. Are we going to see, quote, a dollar reset? I don't see those things happening right at this time yet. So I don't want people running crazy and getting fearful, because that's how many people have become wealthy, is selling fear. And most of those websites that do that are ultimately selling gold anyway. And gold, by the way, has gone down in price for most people, so they've got hurt by this rush to gold. I don't know the day or the hour that they may happen, but I do know this, spiritually speaking, that in order for the gospel to be spread throughout the world, to fulfill the great commission that God has given the body of Christ until he comes, it can't be done without money. God, I don't believe, is going to allow his people to suffer such consequence that the work will simply fall to nothing. I don't believe that. Maybe that's just the ignorance of faith that some would accuse me of having, but I believe God's going to sustain us and bless us. And I actually see some aspect of prosperity in order to get this done. Now, how big it's going to be, how large it's going to be, I don't know. But as believers believe God, I believe he's going to supply needs, and he's going to help us to fulfill the calling and the work that shall be done.
Okay. And thank you, Mark. And let's go to Winford in Texas. And Winford, welcome to Sunlight Broadcasting. You have a quick question or comment?
I have a question. Thank you for taking my call.
Sure.
I want to know if this new world order is going to take place before or after the rapture, or does the Bible say?
Yeah. Well, we don't know. There's always been an effort by Satan to create a new world order or a one world order. We saw that starting back in the Tower of Babel. And we've seen many nations of the world try to gain supremacy over the world. I think there's been 20 international dynasties that have worked very feverishly to create world domination and have failed. And it's never going to really fully be implemented because the return of Christ will be coming in between. So it's not going to happen in its fulfillment. But what I am noticing, and it concerns me, is in the process of it happening, Western society is being greatly affected the most. And why is that? Because Western society is where the gospel was spread predominantly, and it's from Western society that the eastern parts of the world, then southern and northern parts of the world, have got to hear the gospel of Jesus Christ. So God, or I should say Satan, is trying to do his best to stop the West from, that's carrying, I believe, the torch for the sake of the proclamation and the preaching of the gospel. That's why we're feeling, or probably will feel, the effects of it more than other nations of the world. Many of them are already living in conditions that will be, I consider, equal to living under tyranny, living under a controlled or communist society. But we've got to pray, because as I said just a moment ago in answering David's question, I believe the Lord's going to hold back some of that as we exercise faith, so that the gospel can go out to these dark places. And I say dark in the sense that they don't have the light of the gospel, dark in the sense that they don't have the word of God, where we can get Bibles to preachers, where we can get the message of Jesus Christ loves you and died for you to them, whether it be by the airwaves or whether it be by the footpaths. God has a means to do it, and I'm going to believe for our prosperity to get the job done.
We do know that the rise of the Antichrist won't come until after the rapture.
That is correct. Yeah, he will not appear until afterwards. We see that in Second Thessalonians chapter 2, brings that up very clearly. So the rapture, of course, is designed to remove the church because we're not appointed to wrath. Right. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. So we're removed, and then the Antichrist will rise, and it's really the time of Jacob's trouble, the time that God is going to deal with bringing Israel to Jesus Christ. But during those 7 years of tribulation, great things will happen on the earth. God will, of course, bring judgment, but fortunately many people will be saved. 144,000 Jews will be saved. There'll be Christians that are martyrs for their testimony that will be saved. So there's going to be a movement of the Spirit of God on this earth, and then when the Lord returns with the saints to the earth, of course, he'll destroy the Antichrist and his false prophet and set up his kingdom on earth. And then Israel's going to say, where did you receive the wounds in thine hands? And he will tell them, I received them in the house of my friends. And then we'll have 1,000 years of peace because of his righteousness reigning on the earth.
Okay, have we helped you there?
I think so. Appreciate your call.
God bless you.
All right, thank you. And let's go to Michael in North Carolina. Welcome, Michael. You have a quick question for the panel?
I have a question and also some information to John.
Okay.
And I wanted to ask him if he might know about the book written by William F. Jasper, Global Tyranny, Step by Step, United Nations, and Emerging New World Order. It's full of all what we're speaking of about today. It talks about the Rockefeller Foundation, the Carnegie Ford Foundations. It talks about the Council for Relations, Royal Institute, Foreign International Affairs, Trial Commission, Dartmouth Conference, Aspen Institute for Humanistic Studies, Atlantic Institute, and the Bilderberg Group.
Yeah,
And
we'll be dealing with all those on this series as well.
Yeah, and this book is very full of all what you need to know about what's going on. It actually is up to date. It was written in 1993, 92 first printing, and it's done by Western Islands, the Western Islands Publishing Company. It's very good.
Who's the author again, Michael?
William F. Jasper.
William F.
He was a senior editor for New American Magazine, which is a Christian magazine on politics and environment.
Is it Jasper, Jasper? I'm asking you to say that for the sake of the people.
Jasper.
Okay, good. Okay.
It's a very good book.
Excellent.
And also in North Carolina in 1941, they had the legislation's laws of 1941. You go into we went into the Library of State Legislation, North Carolina buildings, and we found this document called HR 338 Resolution 24, a joint resolution providing for a declaration of Federation of the World. And then the second part of it is Declaration of Federation of the World. And it specifically talks about one world government in there. And it more talks about like, sort of like what the European Union is like right now. And if they were supposed to repeal this thing in 1995 in North Carolina, but they failed to do so by one vote.
By one vote. I remember that.
Yeah, because the whole state, I think it was the Senate, was dominated by the Masonic laws. And there's a lot of Masons around here, of course, you know.
Yes, there are.
They have a lot of dominance here and so forth. But they also want to mention to you about Donald Trump. You know, he has Steve Bannon in his cabinet, and he knows Alex Jones real well, and he knows about these things. So, he knows what's going on with Steve Bannon. Of course, he knows all about that stuff, too, about what's going on with